participation in this webinar. I think there are pointers here on how you can ask questions. There is an announcement there about polls and the call for you to use the Q&A box when typing in your questions. So I invite colleagues to please read the quick note on the screen to guide your participation. Okay, colleagues, I think we can begin. I think let's just let the other colleagues who have registered to attend the webinar gather in. But let's give this a start. I'm conscious that some of our resource persons will have to go on after the session so that they can attend to their other work. So let's give this a start. So colleagues, greetings to all of you and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Maria Khan. I am Secretary General of the Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education, or ASPE. We are the organizers of this online conference on education financing, understanding the challenges to this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are delighted to have a good number of our members and partners from all over the world attending. Some of our colleagues in Europe, you just be starting your day, while we know that our members in Australia, in New Zealand, and the South Pacific would just about be ending your work days. If not, some of you may probably have had to dash for a quick dinner to be able to join this event. So we are grateful for the time you are able to give us, and we are grateful for your participation and your presence. This regional conference, colleagues, is organized as part of the overall thrust of ASPE in its ongoing work on capacity building for education advocacy, especially around the SDGs and the SDG 4, and particularly in terms of advocating for education financing that is required to secure inclusive, equitable, quality education and learning opportunities for all by 2030. We are obviously concerned about the impacts of this pandemic on this work. We are concerned that a lot of the gains that we have achieved over the last couple of years and the achievement of the SDG 4s can be eroded, and that we may be set back in our overall fight for the broader vision and mission to advance the right to education. The statistics have been very worrying. I think all of us who track the news, we know that massive school closures have affected 1.5 billion students and learners. We know of the adverse impact on the economies of this pandemic, which has overnight rendered millions of people jobless, millions of people with the loss of their incomes and their livelihoods. And from history, we know that poverty, hunger, food deprivation, and the loss of income are certain considerations and factors that push children and learners out of schools and out of access to learning. And we are fearful it will be even more difficult to get them back into the system. We are also concerned about the allocations to the public education systems in terms of budgets, as we see that economies all over the world are in the red. And we are particularly worried because the situation has not been healthy or rosy even before the pandemic started. We in the Asia Pacific region have been very worried about how there have been, our governments have not been great in allocating budgets as a percentage of GDP to education. We are also aware that education aid has been on a decline and that it has not been, contributions have not met even internationally agreed benchmarks, and they have been short of filling the financing gap, especially with respect to basic education and the core requirements, especially of low-income countries. So we are fearful, we are concerned, we are very worried, but colleagues, this is not a session to tell sub-stories and to lament our collective misfortune. This is a session we present for us to honestly understand, deepen our appreciation of the context, even if it's very bleak, for us to be able to be better equipped to redefine, recast our strategies and our advocacies, especially around education financing, because we do believe that even in this period of crisis, the value of education should not be diminished. In fact, it should be enhanced. And we do know that education is an important strategy and tool that allows us to cope with this crisis and build back better after this crisis. This is the first part of an ongoing set of deliberations within the membership of ASPE around our work on education financing advocacy. After this, this one-day conference, there will be 2 days of ongoing deliberations of our partner national education campaign coalitions in at least 19 countries all over the Asia Pacific, to be informed by the feedback that's come in, the reflections, the information that's been shared in this conference, to inform their work to recast their advocacy strategies, which will play out at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level as we engage with them as ASPE in different policy spaces. So with that introduction, colleagues, about our intentions for this conference, we have assembled a very distinguished group, a very able set of resource persons and speakers. And we have organized our conversation in 2 sets of panels. This is the first, and I will assist in chairing this first panel as well. And the way we've constructed it, colleagues, is we will hear each of the panelists and invite questions and comments only after all the 3 presenters of the first panel have spoken. I will also introduce each of the panelists before they speak, and we will be giving about 20 minutes for each of the panelists to make their presentations. Okay, colleagues, I hope that clarifies where we are, and that clarifies how we will conduct our discussions in the course of the next couple of hours. Okay? So, colleagues, our first speaker, I think for us in the working in education and education advocacy around the SDGs, this colleague needs not much of an introduction. Our first speaker is the director of the Education the Global Education Monitoring Report. He assumed this role in 2017, although he has been an old hand, having joined the report team as early as 2011. The Global Education Monitoring Report has been a very important resource for us in our advocacy efforts within civil society. It has provided an independent voice which tracks progress in relation to global policy commitments in education, earlier within the EFA framework and now within the SDG and SDG4 framework. And it has given us credible data. It has given us credible evidence, which we were able to and still use in our advocacy processes. And it has also set the discourse very high in relation to its attention to drawing worldwide attention, especially of policymakers around issues of equity, issues of inclusion, and wider notions of quality, which have been the bedrock of many of our assertions in civil society. So may I introduce our first speaker, Manos Antoninis, who is going to speak on the implications of COVID-19 on the financing of and equity in education, offering a global perspective. So Manos, you have the floor, and thank you for keeping the high standard of excellence of GEMR under your leadership. Manos.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for joining and for your constant voice of support. And we're looking forward to your feedback on this presentation, which will take you through the most recent developments in public, household, and aid expenditure in education, and what we might foresee could happen in the coming weeks and months, maybe even years, as a result of the recent health crisis that is quickly unfolding into an economic crisis in most parts of the world. Maybe East Asia is the one that might not fall into recession, as trends show, but still its economic development will slow down considerably. So I will share with you some of the latest data, some of which actually is appearing in the forthcoming report that is going to be launched next week. I didn't know that I was going to be led by you. I thought I was going to share my screen. So do I give instructions for you to change the slides? Or do I have, okay, I can, okay. It looks like is it easier to maybe have control over the slides? Because I see there has been some effect also on the clarity of them. If you allowed me to share my screen and change the slides, it might be easier. So let me know if that is possible. But I was going to, while that is happening, I was going to start. Okay, thank you very much. It looks like it might be possible. Or you may let me. So I was going to start while waiting for having some control over my screen by saying that we have some guidance on what might happen to some extent in education from the last great financial crisis that struck the world in 2008-2009. The first slide that I'm going to share, when I do manage to have that chance, was the trend in the spending on education as a percentage of GDP, which, regardless of what we might be thinking, actually has exhibited a remarkable stability over a period of almost 20 years at about 4.5% of GDP globally. Having said that, the two regions whose countries from where this audience is coming from, Central and Southern Asia and Eastern and Southeastern Asia, are the two regions in the world where one observes the lowest levels of spending as a percentage of GDP. So can I try now once again to see? Yes, great, excellent, thank you so much. So so as you see in this graph on the left panel, you see how low, how far below the global average Asia has been over the last almost 20 years. And in addition, you see that there have been other parts of the world, like Latin America and the Caribbean, that have championed education over this period, now spending well above the global average. At the same time, if you look, because the percentage of GDP spent on education is the result of two factors: is how much money countries raise in terms of revenue, in terms of tax, in terms of all the income they can muster to spend on any goods and services, but also how much they prioritize education. So if we unpack this picture, you see on the right-hand side that the main constraint for Central and Southern Asia in terms of spending more on education is the fact that it raises very low amount of domestic revenue, and that's clear because it actually allocates an average of its budget on education close to the global average. So it's not particularly unusual, but because it raises so little in terms of tax income, that's why overall, as a percentage of GDP, education spending is very low. But in the case of Eastern and Southeastern Asia, the trend is to some extent different, because it's a very low prioritization of education that accounts for the fact that it's spent so much below the rest of the world on education. You have repeatedly, as also in the introduction to this webinar, you have been drawing attention to the fact that 1 in 4 countries spend below both benchmarks. There are 2 benchmarks in international education financing, that countries spend at least 4% of GDP on education. I mean, the general advice is between 4 and 6%, and they also spend at least 15% of their budget on education. This is to allow for this fact that some countries manage to raise more revenue, but do not need to spend that much on education. A classic case in your region, of course, is Japan, with a few children, but a robust revenue-raising machinery, while other countries may not be able to raise much tax because they're still at the early stage of development, but they can demonstrate their commitment to education by allocating a large amount of the budget on that. So unfortunately, the latest news is not that the number of countries that fail to meet both benchmarks, which actually should not be acceptable, because either of the two is acceptable, but failing both is really a sign of low commitment to public education. It's now 1 in 3 countries in the world that fail to meet both benchmarks, and that is a call for really far more stronger voice and advocacy to prevent that from happening. And what this graph shows is that actually there are some countries that persistently over the years fail to spend enough on education. This graph shows how the 2 indicators, the share of education as a percentage of GDP, which is on the horizontal axis, and the share of education as a percentage of total public expenditure, have evolved during the years. And you see, for example, that in Pakistan there was an attempt in the 2000s to increase at least the share of education in total public expenditure. It even almost exceeded the 15% benchmark just around 2010, but then it went back, and in the recent years it has been trying to increase again its share, but as you see, as a percentage of GDP, is still very low. And an even more remarkable case is Cambodia. Despite its progress on several indicators, the overall lack of ability to raise enough resources means that at 2% of GDP in 2018 is one of the countries with the lowest amount of spending globally. As an interesting case, you see, for example, China as one country that gradually has been trying to expand. Of course, to a large extent, this is mainly the result of its economy growing and its government managing to raise more resources, which shows how education has increased as a share of GDP, even though it has not increased in any particularly strong way the priority it gives to education. But you see how China in 2016 was spending well above the regional average as a priority assigned in the budget to education. Now let's come to the crisis that we are anticipating. This graph shows growth rates before the crisis and now after the crisis revised for 2020, and what it is anticipated might happen in 2021. That's on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we see projections by the World Bank suggesting what might happen to education expenditure. And as you see, before the crisis, middle-income countries were expected globally to increase their GDP by 4%. But now with the revised data that have come from the IMF, it's clear that middle-income countries will contract by about 3% on average. It's of course the richest countries that will be affected most, given that they have been on quite a long, quite a difficult and protracted lockdown over several months. And you see on the right-hand side that there will be, of course, rebounding into 2021, but overall education spending, especially in middle-income countries, is expected to suffer more. We might see declines of even 8%, which is really particularly worrying, especially considering that before the crisis, education expenditure was supposed to, or was expected to grow however weakly, by about 2%. So that's a major concern, especially because the projection for 2021 is that there will be hardly any change. So we're expecting a large decline on public spending if education does not receive a stronger priority, and if funding goes to all the other activities. Now, of course, we know that it's not just education that should receive money in order for education indicators to prosper. As Maria was saying in the introduction, there are a lot of concerns about the impact of the education of the economic crisis on household spending, on household budgets, and the fact that some families may not be able to spend because they might lose their jobs. So economic support packages and relief packages might be just as important on education. So it's a really very finely balanced exercise that governments have to make in order to address the effects of the crisis. But this graph is particularly striking in what is likely to happen in Asia, where most countries are of the middle income, in the middle income range. So going to the next slide, I did not mention, of course, that income education spending may decrease by 8%, but at the same time, a number of categories of expenditure may need to grow because of the effects of this crisis on individual disengagement from education, losses of learning, etc. So we are actually now working, and it's a piece of work that we will be able to share with the international community next month. We know, first of all, that there will be a loss of learning. That's something that everybody acknowledges, and therefore education systems may need to invest in remedial education of different kinds. They will need to exert particular effort to ensure that vulnerable and marginalized children that might be encouraged to drop out of school, leave school early, will need to be brought back, and campaigns, but also all sorts of incentives will need to be provided to make sure that this does not happen. Of course, we have as I mentioned, the effect of lower growth, the effect on jobs, prosperity, household prosperity, and the ability to fund supplementary activities in education that are often quite important. And if one were to choose, which we know it's unrealistic, but maybe some countries may decide to invest in conditions in classrooms that will be more amenable to deal with the virus effect. They might want to have additional teachers to split classrooms, or they might want to invest in particular hygiene facilities that they don't have. All that could also add to the cost. So that is not included in this analysis that you saw before. In fact, it means that it makes such spending even more questionable if the situation is what we currently observe. One slide to move to the second category of spending. I mentioned public expenditure. But before we move to the external expenditure on aid, it's important to take a stop and consider the situation with household spending. This will be, by the way, the theme of the report in 2021, which will be focusing on non-state actors. So you see from this graph The percentage globally in a group of high, middle, and low income countries, there's more data on high income countries, on how much households account for total spending on education. Is a highly illuminating graph that has not received sufficient attention over the years, and which we hope to draw attention to next year. And we often think that the reason that it does not attract attention is the fact that in high income countries, families spend contribute a very small share of total expenditure on education, because public education systems are well developed, and it's mainly at higher education level where you see families paying out of their pocket. Just to explain, so the dark part of this bar shows the percentage of households. I have put blue color for countries from Asia that feature in this graph, and you see that in a set of lower middle income countries like Indonesia or Cambodia, households spend very high percentage of total education of the total education effort. In Cambodia, it's almost 2/3 of the total spending, which is not surprising if you combine this information with the fact that the government is spending one of the lowest amounts globally. And you also see that in Nepal, with the last blue column on the right, which is a reminder that, contrary to what one might expect and what one might want, it is in poorer countries where we find households paying more out of their pocket for education. This is a very, very poignant sign that of how the lives of these families might be affected, considering that their incomes will suffer more, because we know that the effect of the crisis is also highly unequal, affecting primarily the poorest in each country. So let me now quickly take you to a few slides on aid to education, where it's the part where we've done some more analysis. We will be launching a policy paper next month, early next month, on that. So this draws on this analysis. So let's take first of all the long-term view of aid in general. This graph shows how much rich countries, the thick red, the black line at the bottom that refers to DAC, it's the Development Assistance Committee. It's a group of countries of the OECD that are traditional donors. You see that they have been spending for the past 15 years, the last 15 years in this graph, about 0.3% of their gross national income on aid. And that's less than half of what many of those member countries have actually committed to, which was the 0.7%. So their spending needs to grow by at least twice to meet that original commitment. And you see the individual performances of the five largest donors to basic education, bilateral donors. So you see Norway already from the 1970s, when it became an oil-rich country, it committed itself to international development and has maintained a high level of spending. The United Kingdom, in a few years ago, committed to meet the 0.7% target, to which, as you see, it's interesting, it has stuck to in the last 5-6 years, and is expected to stick also with this during this crisis. The increase in Germany is a bit misleading, in the sense that a large part of that comes from the expenditure that incurred during the refugee crisis, because some of those costs counted as aid. We see, of course, Japan has been spending below the global average, but we see in recent years an interesting increase to converge to the global average. And the United States has been actually decreasing its commitment in recent years, already one of the lowest in the world. So with spending being so stagnant in terms of, in relative terms, not in absolute terms. In absolute terms, it has been increasing, but in relative terms, it has been going. It has been in absolute terms has been increasing. Given that low and middle income countries grow faster than high income countries, the effect is that aid as a percentage of countries' gross domestic product is actually going down. The one interesting detail is that since 2015, after the commitment to the SDGs, we have observed a slight increase in the share of aid to low-income countries' GDP levels. That's the orange line, which is now around 9%. But in lower middle income countries, which includes, of course, some of the countries in the regions in Asia, the share is very, very low. It's less than 1% and has been gradually declining. Nevertheless, it is an interesting injection of funds in some critical areas, especially areas related to technical assistance. So it's worth observing. Aid to education, in fact, has returned to a growth path in recent years. 2018 was a record year. It reached $15.6 billion. Basically, after a few years of stagnation in the aftermath of the financial crisis, which I will explain what the reason was. But it's very important to also remember that spending that goes to basic and secondary education, to lower middle income countries, so the countries and the sectors that we care most about, is less than half of that total. So only 7.4 billion actually goes to these sectors. But as I mentioned, the reason behind the decline in the early years of this decade was not, in fact, the financial crisis per se. Aid was one of the factors, the financing flows that suffered least during the crisis. Remittances suffered, investment suffered, but aid was basically stagnating and continued then increasing. The problem in the case of education was that in the beginning of this decade, it was still suffering of becoming a lower and lower priority. About 15 years ago, 15% of total aid was going to education, but in 2013, it reached the lowest level of 10%, or less than 10%, as you see on this graph at the line at the top. And a reminder, given that only one part of that aid actually goes to basic and secondary education, it's only 6% of the total that goes to basic and secondary education. And a few years ago, the report had indicated that not only do rich countries need to spend 0.7% of their national income on aid, of that they need to spend at least 10%. So even that amount of prioritizing basic and secondary education needs to increase if we are to fill the gap. A quick word on GPE. Which has attracted interest as a potential vehicle of support to countries in this crisis. Indeed, as you see on the right-hand side, over the years, the GPE became an increasingly more important source of funds for countries, which was in many ways a good thing, because support from GPE is targeting the poorest countries and is also aligned with the national education plans. But after 2014, we saw that so basically in 2018 and 2019, the amount of funding slowed down, maybe the result of new rules introduced, maybe the result of the fast growth in earlier years that could not be sustained. So spending from GPE slowed down. Having said that, this does not reflect the commitments, the higher commitments that were made in 2018. But the problem is it takes years for GPE to convert pledges into allocation decisions and then actual expenditure. So we've seen this decline, but we're probably likely to see that changing in 2020, given all the amount of money that was available, and the crisis helped facilitate and speed up their allocation. You probably heard about $500 million worth package of support just for COVID related crisis in recent weeks. Finally, a projection on what we might see. It's as you can imagine, it's very difficult to really project and predict the future. But this is a reminder that in the last financial crisis, the GDP of the 10 largest donors declined by 3.2% at the peak of the crisis in 2009. Whereas now we know that in 2020, these same countries will probably see a twice as large recession. And that is a warning sign of what could happen. You remember we said before, maybe just to say that the aid was not particularly affected last time, but now with the severity of the crisis, that might no longer be the case. This graph shows the three growth rates of the three key parameters that we're talking about. The purple line is a percentage of GDP growth rate As you see, it's generally constant, is about 2% globally. But aid, um, um, which is the overall red line, fluctuates much more, and aid to education fluctuates even more, because when some large donors spend a lot in one year, then they spend much less the following year. So it's very difficult to observe and follow. But you see where the arrow points, that in 2011-12, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, both aid and aid to education in particularly slowed down more than usual. So they didn't bounce back. They stayed with a negative sign for 2 years in a row, which hasn't happened. So with the projection of the aid of growth, as you see at the end of the line, being as negative, we might expect to see, maybe not in 2020, maybe not in 2021, but immediately afterwards, a decline. So what we tried to do was to make assumptions about what could happen, what we could observe. As I said, it's very difficult. We don't know what might happen in 2020. We don't know if countries had some money and they might just disperse it now to help countries in need, or whether they might struggle to spend it because, of course, during COVID, we've had a lot of problems in travel, assistance, meetings, coordination. So we have no idea what to expect. But basically doing a simulation that things could be more or less similar to what happened in the previous crisis, we see that inevitably aid to education will take about 5 years to return to the spending levels in 2018. So you see it will take until 2023, maybe even 2024, to see it returning to the levels we had 2 years ago. So just to conclude, public expenditure levels in Asia are already quite low and would need to increase, which is even more urgent given that demands are going to increase further. And I'm sure Maki will say much more about what actions specifically are happening in countries in the region. Private expenditure is already high. It's an area where countries need to pay much more attention if they want to ensure equity. It's probably the most disequalizing factor overall. And aid expenditure may be declining in importance, but if it helps, if the overall international financial architecture maintains an interest in ensuring that the share of education remains the same, if it continues to respond with flexibility, and if it continues to align with national education sector plans, then we might at least see a higher effectiveness and efficiency of its contribution. So that brings me to an end. Just a reminder, in a week from now, same time, in fact, exactly the same time, we will be launching our next edition of the Global Education Monitoring Report. For the first time, given the circumstances, we will be launching it globally. The theme is inclusion in education. All means all is the hashtag and the call for action. I also have added on this slide as a reminder the fact that, first of all, back in January, we launched a new website, which we call Education Progress, or Scoping Progress in Education, which is a very helpful complement to the monitoring part of the Global Education Monitoring Report that allows people like you all over the world to actually interact and see a narrative of 5 stories in international education, ability to visualize that you don't have with this printed version. So I strongly encourage you to visit that website. On Tuesday next week, we will be launching a new website, which is a contribution we have long wanted to make to the international debate on education. This website is called Peer, and basically we have documented the efforts that every country in the world makes, except for Europe, which is already covered by other resources, to address inclusion in education. So this is a site where we will be documenting the efforts that countries make on the theme of the report. So next year we will be working on ensuring that there is a description, for example, of how countries regulate the provision of education through the private sector. So this is a resource that we would very much like to see you embrace and help, and we very much are looking for partnership in the future in helping develop it and being used as a resource for peer learning, and that's why it's called peer. So these country profiles. And finally, WIDE, which as of last year, we have been now co-curating with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, is always a very valuable source of information to make sure that you know the situation on equity in education around the world. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to wait for questions later on after the other two speakers have spoken. Do register, by the way, to attend the global launch in a week's time. I need to stop sharing, and I've done. I think some microphones are mute. There, Maria. And some, okay.
Okay, thank you, Manos. Yeah, I think there's a problem with Maria's internet, so let me assist in moderating the session. Okay, so thank you very much, Manos, for that very important input that you have made with regards to education financing. So now we go to the next speaker, and who will talk about what countries are doing in Asia Pacific with regards to education and how it is affected by COVID-19 pandemic. So with us, we have Ms. Maki Hayashikawa. She is the Section Chief of Inclusive Quality Education at UNESCO Bangkok. And Maki, as we call her, also served as a Section Chief at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, France. She has decades of experience in the areas of education, early childhood care and education, gender, and 15 years of her work being in the Asia Pacific region with such organizations such as UNESCO, UNICEF, and the Japan International Cooperation Agency. So, Maki, we're very happy to have you. So please take it away and start with your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Thea. My microphone's okay, and I think for my presentation, there will be somebody to be operating on my behalf. I'm fine. I would just say next slide, please. Okay,
Yes, okay.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, good afternoon, probably good morning, and even good evening, depending on where you may be. A big warm welcome from Bangkok from myself. As introduced by Thea, my name is Mukhesh Kawa, here based in UNESCO Regional Bureau for Education in Asia Pacific. First of all, I wish to congratulate ASPE for organizing this virtual regional conference on a very vital topic, and also to express my sincere thanks for inviting me to join this to share some observations on the impact of COVID-19 on education in our region, which I hope could help provide a general overview and a context to the conference theme on education financing in times of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, next, please. My presentation has 5 parts. First, a short overview of the current situation in our region, and then I'll try to highlight some key issues and concerns that have emerged with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in our region. Third, the challenges that countries within the region and beyond are facing and struggling with still, and I'll try to zoom into several thematic areas just to illustrate the nature and scope of the impact on education. And of course, these are not really an exclusive list, it's just a selected few, just to show some cases. And to conclude, I'll try to share some key takeaways from what we have learned so far since we started to monitor the impact of COVID-19 on education with possible recommendations. And of course, my presentation is by no means intended to provide solutions to the situation, but hope to leave some food for thought that could be contributing to the further sessions of this conference. Next slide, please. Now, let me turn now briefly to update you on the current situation. Since March this year, UNESCO has been tracking the impact of COVID-19 on the education sector, particularly on the school closure situation. At the onset of the pandemic outbreak, over 90% of the world's learners were affected by school closures. As of yesterday, this has improved a bit, but still there are over 1.09 billion learners, representing a bit over 62% of world's total enrolled student population who continue to be affected. Now, if we zoom into one part of our region, the East Asia and the Pacific region, nearly 325 million children are missing school for nearly 2 months or more, and this is in addition to the 35 million children who are already out of school pre-COVID-19. School closures also meant not only having students out of school, but also teachers, principals, and other education personnel being out of school, or in the worst case, sometimes out of job. We know that at least 64 million primary and secondary teachers have been affected by the pandemic worldwide. And I'm sorry, I'm very much zooming into pre-primary teachers here, but since we have the data that over 4.4 million pre-primary teachers in 24 countries in our region have also been affected directly. A slightly brighter news is that as of yesterday, 15 June, 23 countries in our region have reopened schools fully, and many more are likely to follow suit in the coming month. Next slide, please. As we monitor the school closure status, UNESCO, and often together with our partner agencies, has also been conducting various surveys, studies, and series of webinars to try to understand the magnitude of the impact of COVID-19 on education. So this presentation is based mainly on the findings that have been obtained from these work. And as such, the information here I present may be a slight mixture of both regional and global perspectives. But I think the information and data we have so far been able to compile help us to highlight common issues and challenges that many countries are facing. Among this list, the 3 surveys highlighted in red are specific to the Asia-Pacific region, and the regional rapid situation analysis on the impact of COVID-19 is actually currently ongoing. So I'm afraid I cannot really share the results or findings from the survey yet, which is due to come out around August and September. So please stay tuned. Next slide, please. Now, let me share with you what these survey studies and webinars have taught us so far. With the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, UNESCO immediately launched an online survey. This is a global survey to quickly understand how countries were responding to this health crisis and what they were most concerned about with the school closure. This online survey received 100 responses covering 59 countries, of which 21 came from our region, Asia Pacific. So our region is roughly representing 1/3 of the survey results. The concerns reported in 2 areas, health and well-being and ensuring management and learning. And on the health and well-being side, the largest concern was the psychological effect on children, especially when they are going into confinement, and along with the social isolation of learners. On the other hand, with educational ensuring management and learning, the biggest concern was about parents' preparedness or unpreparedness to look after the children's learning at home. I think we have to admit that not all parents can become their children's teachers naturally, automatically. It's not necessarily about their knowledge or skills to teach a subject, but also it requires a lot of time to look after children's learning, and especially supporting them throughout the confinement, and especially when parents also may have to work at home themselves. And of course, this is followed by other concerns like interrupted learning and disrupted school calendar, and also the financial cost that is incurred. Next slide, please. Of course, the immediate response to COVID-19 was the school closure. We all know that. Countries have since been developing response plans, typically based on a phased approach in order to address short-term, mid-term, and long-term issues and concerns. The real challenges of ensuring learning continuity under this unprecedented situation have been reported to be more complex and profound, affecting all countries, whether being a high-income or low-income countries. For example, how can we ensure equitable access to quality education for all learners, regardless of where they are? I mean, should it be through online digital platforms or through more conventional mode of distance remote learning? Should we use TVs, radios, or even correspondence by post? Or how should we actually have, materials, learning materials delivered to home and having teachers to pay a visit from time to time? Questions arose like, how can we monitor and support to protect the health, safety, and social emotional well-being of children, but also teachers and the families? How do we maintain the motivation to learn and teach while in confinement at home? Many teachers themselves also found very difficult to maintain their motivation to teach. How can we also ensure the nutritional health of children, especially during school closure? We know that in many of our countries in our region, vulnerable children depend on school meals sometimes as their one and only proper daily food intake. And what about teachers? We tend to forget about teachers when we talk about school closure. We are always worried about the children themselves. But teachers, they were directly and indirectly impacted, and I'll share a bit more information later. But were they really prepared? Are they equipped and skilled to suddenly teach remotely, particularly using online platforms? What kind of support do they really need, and have they been receiving those effective in order to effectively continue teaching and supporting their students? Next slide, please. Now, the short to midterm issues are essentially about ensuring access, equity, and quality of learning during school closures. And regardless of their income level, all countries are facing the same challenges. And that's what our surveys and studies are telling us. Access in terms of access to textbooks and reading materials at home, in terms of learners and teachers both having access to the needed or appropriate equipment or technology to study through a distance, or do all learners and teachers have access to educational resources? In terms of equity, this is probably the most important, as reported by many stakeholders to our surveys, that school closure is resulting in widening inequity gap in education between those who have access to the technology and means to continue education and those who do not. In terms of quality, even when learners have access to a distance education provision, we have received reports that the content are not always following the curriculum, or are not updated, or even outdated. And also there's been cases reported where the subject content was not even accurate. So the curriculum or the materials presented on the TV or remote learning platforms were actually not correct. We also see that most challenging of all with the school closure was really about how to monitor and assess the learning progress when conventional ways of assessment testing was no longer possible. Next slide, please. So here, I thought it would be good to also zoom into several thematic issues, how COVID-19 is specifically impacting on access, equity, and equality of education from the perspectives of gender, learning assessment, teachers, and higher education. And I'm sorry, but this selection of the theme are also rather random, but also based on the information and data availability on our side, my side as well. So starting with gender equality, this health crisis is really exacerbating the gender inequality in various ways. And the risk here is that the gains made in gender equality, especially with reference to SDG 4.5 in education, could be lost if actions are not really taken right away. Because we understand that women and girls have been more exposed to the virus. They are primary healthcare providers at home and in healthcare facilities. Distance learning, both digital solutions and low-tech means like radio and TVs are not considering the lived realities and inequalities faced by girls. For example, in Afghanistan, women and girls' access to technology is not always allowed or prioritized due to the patriarchal culture. COVID-19 has led numerous families also losing their means of livelihood, and this is actually putting girls at risk of early marriage, being kind of married off. In some countries, mobility has been limited for female teachers due to social norms, and which has greatly impacted on their ability to continue teaching remotely, and areas where sometimes teachers had to visit the students' houses to continue and support their learning. At home, girls may be overburdened by unpaid work, unable to continue their learning at a distance, and they're also exposed to growing risk of domestic violence by staying longer hours all day at home. And this is also going to really jeopardize their return to education later on when school reopens. But of course, when you talk about gender, it's not just about girls. Boys are also at risk of disengaging from education during this critical period of school closure. For example, in Nepal, we have heard that they have been fearing that economic hardships caused by the outbreak of the COVID-19 may actually lead boys to turn into income-generating activities to support families and may end up leaving school totally. Next slide, please. Now, school closures have had a direct impact on quality of learning and learning assessment. And it is probably the biggest impact for some countries, particularly in our region, that has a strong test culture. The crisis itself was the impact on learning assessment has really huge because some major international high-stake exams are actually canceled for the first time in history. Of course, it may not apply to everyone, but for example, the International Baccalaureate was canceled after its 100 years of history of having this exam. So that was a major scandal. But for our region, we carried out a regional rapid survey in April to try to understand what countries are doing. And we found out that countries were actually trying to quickly adopt to the different strategy to cope with the situation. Of course, in many cases, a mix of different strategy to cope with the situation, like organizing exams with special arrangements, canceling, postponement, rescheduling, or even going online assessment. These alternative approaches are being introduced, exams and validation learning, such as reducing number of subjects tested or moving to automatic recognition and validation of student learning, issuing conditional offers, especially if it's about entrance exams to university and so on. But at the same time, countries seem to be still worried, and they are not, they are yet to understand how learning outcomes will be affected by the reduction in classes or learning hours, whether the results will be comparable to the previous cohort. Should the large-scale learning assessment should be revised as we go forward with implementing school reopening strategies? These were questions that still came up through our survey. Since our region, Asia Pacific, is a very diverse region with various varying systems, contexts, and resource and capacities, we also understand that there is really no one-size-fits-all solution to coping with the school closures and the impact on learning assessment right now. But of course, any alternative measures must be complemented by remedial and auxiliary courses upon school reopening to offset possible gaps in student learning and to avoid unfair treatment resulting from teacher biases in grading, automatic recognition, and validation of learning as opposed to exams. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick snapshot from the global survey carried out in May, just to show that the similar findings have been found globally as well as what we have found at the Asia Pacific regional level. The majority of countries are postponing or rescheduling the dates of the exams, and many countries are really trying to cope with how to re-administer the exams at the moment. Some countries which has maintained their exams, either planned or by delaying it, have been also introducing and testing out online examinations, or even trying to reduce the curriculum content to be addressed so that there will be less unfair treatment on the learning difficulties that learners were facing during school closure. Next slide, please. And back to our region, here are some examples of measures taken by countries based on a rapid survey. Here, the different measures and responses are summarized: maintaining exams, or canceling or postponing, or introducing alternate approaches. For example, in Uzbekistan, examinations have been conducted either on the full curriculum or on an adapted curriculum, depending on the duration of the emergent situation. And the ministry has sent schools and community guidelines to conduct assessment on a distance mode using platforms or home-based learning environment. On the other hand, in Bhutan, considering majority of the students are actually in rural areas with limited access to internet and broadcast media, standard examinations on the adapted curriculum was not really recommended. So examination will be conducted on a regular curriculum once classes resume, either on the full curriculum or on the prioritized adapted curriculum, depending on the length of school closure they would end up with. Next slide, please. Now, COVID-19 has had direct and indirect impact on our education personnel at all levels, which means including early childhood all the way up to higher education. With schools being closed, priority attention has always been on the learners, how to support and facilitate and motivate them to continue their learning through various modalities. But then teachers also need attention, as teaching in the classroom and teaching remotely are totally different experience, skills, and expectations. Now, the COVID-19 has led many teachers into unemployment as well due to the slowdown of the economy. I think we talk about unemployment of other sectors, but the education workforce is no exception to this. In particular, teachers and personnel, education personnel in private profit education institutions have been more vulnerable than teachers in the public school sector. From a recent regional survey on early childhood care, ECE, early childhood education workforce, we found that ECE personnel are actually putting their own health at risk at the same time, as they are asked to continue and provide face-to-face care and education for the children of essential frontline workers, often being in the health sector. But this is a bit ironic because I think for the EC advocates, we also consider that EC workforce are actually essential frontline workers, and they also need their support. Of course, teachers and other education personnel have their own families with children who could be staying at home due to school closure, and they will need to look after their own children, making it difficult for them to concentrate on preparing and teaching remotely. And it's really not only about the current teachers, but the pandemic is already having implications for our future teaching workforce. A school closure is not only with primary and secondary schools, but also with teacher training centers and institutions. So with this, it is anticipated that the longer the situation continues, the higher the risk of ending up with a shortage of qualified teachers in the future in our region and of course beyond. Next slide, please. Just a brief sharing here, the summary of one of the findings from our regional survey on ECE workforce, that we understood the majority of teachers in early childhood were not really prepared to cope with the sudden school closures, shifting to remote teaching and learning overnight. They have not received any prior training before the crisis broke out, and also most of them really lacked any understanding of how to manage crisis or disaster in general. Next slide, please. I also wish to remind ourselves that the impact has not only been on school education, which of course we tend to focus more because of the sheer number of learners, but also in higher education. And we should not forget that higher education is one of our SDG 4 targets, namely 4.3 and 4.B in terms of scholarship in higher education institutions. With the outbreak of the pandemic and school closures, 1 in 4 students of higher education institutions are actually not attending classes. For example, we hear the case from Japan that 87% of universities and colleges could not start their new semester in April this year. International students or mobile students have probably been the most hardest hit, the hardest hit among those. Among them, resulting in an above average a drop in retention rates. Many students are unable to continue or complete their program as their host institutions at their host institution due to mobility or financial constraints. Again, in Japan, many students have been reported that they have lost part-time jobs and went into serious financial crisis in order to continue their studies. Of course, higher education may be a little bit more advantaged and privileged than public schools at a lower level, but of course, higher education institutions also were forced to introduce immediate and simultaneous responses to ensure the continuation of learning and teaching. But many untried and untested methodologies and practices usually relied on primarily on the willingness and capacity of academic and non-teaching staff. And of course, the quality and the results of these teachings are yet to be assessed. The crisis also revealed that there are significant gaps in knowledge, capacity, and funding for the provision of online or blended learning between institutions and countries. And the digital divide and the lack of preparation, both in developed and developing countries, result in slow measure to move courses from face-to-face to online, and some institutions have not been able to mitigate the consequences effectively. while higher education institutions that were already implementing flexible learning pathways seem to have been better equipped to cope with the impact of COVID-19 and maintain connected with their students. Next slide, please. As schools are gradually reopening, either partially or in a phased manner or fully already, the longer-term concerns and issues must become a priority attention now. There will be a continued concern for the health and safety of school environment, and new guidelines are being issued for schools to introduce new ways of managing the school buildings, classrooms, as well as the way we interactions between teachers and students. The re-engagement of learners and teachers in the new normal classroom is nothing that we can probably pick up right away. Many guidelines that are produced by UNESCO, UNICEF, World Bank, and World Food Program together have been translated into different languages in the region. A critical issue for every country is how to really ensure all children and youth will return to school when schools reopen, especially when and where families have lost their means of livelihood and children have become their sources of income and labor, and especially, as mentioned before, girls for their domestic chores. The return of students to school is, of course, far from the end of the story, because without any delay, we need to address effectively and quickly the learning losses after 2 to 3 months of school closure. It's very much feared that many learners would have relapsed into their studies, even for those who had access and were able to continue learning by distance. The learning gap between the advantaged and less well-off or disadvantaged children is likely to have widened already. And as we have also just heard from Manu's presentation, how can we ensure that education finance, both domestic resource and donor investment, can we actually maintain it? Though we know that very unlikely that there will be an increase, to say the least. And this is really the main focus of this regional conference. Next slide, please. As mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, in our region, as of yesterday, 23 countries have now reopened schools in full. Most countries will be reopening in a phased manner or fully in the coming month. Globally, according to the most recent survey that UNESCO conducted together with UNICEF and World Bank in May, with a response rate of 99 countries, some 95% of countries have already reopened or are intending to reopen schools rather soon, which is in contrast with the situation in April, where only 55% of countries were anticipating to reopen their education institutions. So I think globally, schools are coming out, reopening very quickly, and we hope to see many students returning to school. Next slide, please. Now, once schools are reopened, what are the measures being considered in order to address the learning loss? Most countries are planning to organize remedial learning programs to support students that may have fallen behind in their learning and preparation for national examinations. The level and scope of the catch-up programs would depend also on learner-specific needs based on the assessment learning experiences and effectiveness of the distance learning that took place, especially for most disadvantaged students who require extra support or guidance. Many countries are also aiming to reduce the curriculum content taught this year in order not to overload and further stretch students that require support, not only academically, but more on their psychosocial and well-being needs. Now, countries plan to deploy remedial accelerated learning programs through various strategies, such as leveraging the potential of blended learning through a mixture of distance school-based learning, organizing catch-up lessons during school vacation period, that will be happening in Thailand, adjusting the next school year with additional lessons to cover the content that has been insufficiently covered during the pandemic, and so on. But I think it's really kind of worrisome to note that 1/3 of the countries that responded to this global survey, that they were really anticipating a lot of disruption in the coming school calendar. Next slide, please. Maybe I could skip on the next coming 3 slides, which are basically about the economic impact and financial aspects of it, which were already covered by Manas. So if we could skip 3 slides. Next, please. Next. Click, click. Oh, sorry, I forgot to take off the animation. Just please go on and click until the next slide. Thank you. So In order to kind of conclude this presentation, I thought I'd like to summarize by recapping a number of key takeaways that we have been able to extract from the various survey studies and webinars conducted since March. First, it's very clear technology is indeed playing a key role. Of course, it doesn't mean that everyone has equitable access to the technology that is required to continue good, effective learning, but it is playing a key role. Equity among all is an even more serious concern now, and maybe because of the technology, the digital divide that still exists very deeply in our region. The role of teachers and parents are also critically important in supporting their sustaining the children's learning and their motivation to continue learning. And I like to emphasize that support to parents have been even increasingly critical at the time of school closure, as they become the single source of student support to continue learning and also look after the social well-being, social emotional well-being. And then health and well-being of students during school closure will, of course, continue to be the top priority for most countries, even after schools reopen. While various support programs are also being put in place to address the health and learning challenges together. And lastly, but not least, monitoring learning during school closure is posing to be a daunting task. And with many high-stake national assessments being canceled or postponed, the countries will have to really set priorities on how to make sure that learning loss is addressed in the coming month. Next slide, please. And this will basically be my last slide in this presentation. Some key recommendations for our stakeholders, largely between governments and development partners, but of course we have other actors in our community. For governments, we could try to minimize the impact of learning with special emphasis on equity and inclusion. We should pay more attention to social emotional learning and development and well-being of students, as I mentioned earlier. Based on the lessons learned, we should also try to make education systems more resilient against future crises. And this is actually more of an opportunity that we should bank on. And as we move to distance learning, we need to deploy more mix of distance teaching, learning, and monitoring options and approaches. And we do see that from these the findings of surveys and studies that probably a mixed method, a blended approach will be most feasible in most countries. And of course, for us in development partners, we need to try to provide flexible funding, especially for low-income countries, in order to fill the gap and mitigate the financial impact. Invest in long-term development of core, more resilient education systems. And of course, we have to ensure equity inclusion in the response that we actually are supporting that are developed by countries. So next slide, please skip the next slide. And the last slide. Thank you very much. Back to you, Thea.
Well, thank you very much, Maki. That was an excellent presentation, and which certainly provides us a lot of food for thought as we plan our advocacies ahead. Colleagues, you would have seen perhaps a lot of movement in the Q&A. Where a number of questions that were addressed to Manoj in his earlier presentation were also answered. So we invite those who wish to direct their questions to the last presentation of Maki to please put your questions in the Q&A box. We are running short of time, so it would be helpful if you put them in, and Maki will attempt, or we ask Maki to attempt to respond to these questions addressed to her in the Q&A box as well. Okay, colleagues, so now for the last, certainly not the least, speaker, we have with us, and we're delighted to have with us, Nepomuceno Malaluan, who is the Undersecretary in the Department of Education in the Government of the Philippines. In this role, Nepo, as many of us tend to call him, has been supervising a lot of key priority programs of the department. And one of them, which is very apt for the conversation we're having today, is around the Department of Education's Learning Continuity Plan in the context of the COVID pandemic. So he is extremely well-versed and in a very strong position to share his thoughts on country challenges in financing education to achieve SDG 4 and address the impact of COVID-19. Nepo will, of course, speak from his experience in the Philippines and in the very important position he holds in the Department of Education in the Philippines. But Nepo obviously will bring in his perspectives as well, being an active player as a representative of the Philippine government, as one of the member states represented in the Education 2030 Steering Committee. So Nepo, you have the floor, and thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you to ASBE and all your partners, and to all our friends present today. Good afternoon from the Philippines, and thank you for this opportunity to share our perspective from the Philippine Department of Education on the country impact of COVID-19 on education finance. Can you put up my slides, please? Can you go to the first slide? Next slide, please. Yeah, all our past crises of recent history have really not prepared us for a crisis like COVID-19. The physical distancing of quarantine, whether individually or of entire communities, as a major part of COVID-19 containment, has disrupted the operations of practically all sectors of the economy. In the Philippines, the concern over the basic education sector is the volume of people moving from home to schools and congregating in schools and classrooms at the risk of contact and transmission of COVID-19. In the Philippine basic education, we account for 30 million individuals, of which 27 million are learners from kindergarten to grade 12, 900,000 are teachers from the public school system, and another 300,000 from the private school system. And this represents nearly 28% of our total population in the country, and even 20% higher than the number of people employed in the services sector, which is our biggest employer of the labor force. Next slide. Now, this disruption in economic activities across the country and across all sectors has resulted in very intense competition for resources among sectors and agencies of the government for adjustment measures and to fund recovery when it starts. And in this intense competition, sometimes, or even for a good part of it, education is placed at disadvantage amid the emergence of health, social amelioration, and economic recovery drivers as the key priorities for adjustment and recovery finance. And there are sections, unfortunately, of society who are predisposed to taking a position that education can wait, putting education in danger of being devalued. Next slide, please. Thus, really, the challenge for us is for the education sector to be able to defend learning continuity. And we can only do that if we can defend as well education finance. And in the Philippines, our approach has been two-pronged. The first is to emphasize that learning delivery in a safe manner is possible. And second, to show that safe learning continuity in the time of COVID-19 constitutes as well necessary and sound investments for education transformation for the future. Next slide. Now, to be able to convey to our critical stakeholders and decision makers that approach and framework, it is important for us to be able to employ a number of strategies. And among this, not exhaustively, is first to really be able to develop a broadly supported and evidence-based learning continuity plan for clarity and unity of direction in this time of crisis, to be able to engage key decision makers, whether in the executive, in interagency processes, or in the cabinet, or the legislature or Congress, and very important for our country, local government units. Of course, such a framework must be able to develop a broad constituency and develop partnerships for support, whether it be from the general public, the education policy community, parents, teachers, and the education bureaucracy itself. And very important that we have seen in the present times is the necessity for effective risk communication in the context and atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, and too much noise arising from the COVID-19 situation. Next slide, please. Now, with that approach, that is the our perspective in developing and completing our basic education learning continuity plan. Uh, we have already completed it and submitted it to Congress, the executive, and to other sectors, titled Learning Opportunities Shall Be Available, the Basic Education Learning Continuity Plan in the Time of COVID-19. And this learning continuity plan provides guidance to all levels of governance of our Department of Education, as well as to our education partners in fulfilling our responsibility to provide learning opportunities to all our children and youth. And this was developed through a very participatory approach, which involved both the internal and external partners and the internal bureaucracy. And we also had the advice from our chairpersons of our legislative committees on basic education. Now, next slide. What are the key principles that underlie our uh, learning continuity plan? Uh, this, uh, these principles include first, the need and paramount concern for the protection of the health, safety, and well-being of our learners, and to contribute to the overall prevention for the further transmission of COVID-19. But we emphasize that while protecting health, safety, and well-being, we must at the same time find ways to ensure learning to continue. And uh, to the point or to the extent that we shall at some point be able to conduct physical classes again, then we need to be able to facilitate the safe return of learners and teachers to schools. Of course, it has already been stated that there will be a number of equity manifestation of new issues and concerns, and we need to be very, very sensitive to that and endeavor to address them as best we can. We emphasize, as we mentioned on the second component of the framework, is to be able to emphasize that this is not a mere emergency response, but we must be able to link it to investments for education transformation for the future. Next slide, please. What are the key components of our learning continuity plan? There are four major components of that. We have, within the context of our ongoing review of the K to 12 curriculum, we have streamlined our K to 12 curriculum just for this year of COVID-19 context to the most essential learning competencies. Uh, that this would allow us to focus instruction as well as to lighten the load for conversion of learning resources intended for classroom setting to ones that are adapted for distance learning. Of course, we are preparing all the learning delivery modalities with blended and distance learning as the major components. And this necessitates as well upskilling and reskilling of teachers for such distance learning modality. Uh, we also need to prepare for the eventuality of physically returning to school by adopting required health standards for implementations in schools and workplaces. And based on that, all the support components of the delivery of education sector were reconfigured as well. Next slide, please. Uh, I will skip the next slide. This is just preparing for the various modalities based on the differential conditions of learners, whether this be in printed or digital offline modules that will be delivered to the homes of the students or picked up by their parents. Of course, where it is technologically feasible and they have the gadgets at the home, then online learning resources should be provided. And we are going to complement this as well with educational TV and radio-based instruction. Next slide, please. Now, what we are trying to do in the learning continuity plan is for the central office leverage and mobilize resource support. But at the end of the day, it will be the field units that will be able to adapt these options and menu to the specific context of the local conditions. Next slide, please. Now, on the second point, as we mentioned, it will not be enough to discuss that it is possible to have learning continuity in a safe manner, but we must be able to show that this is not only an emergency response, but it also constitutes sound investment and necessary investment into the future of education. And so, in relation to this, it was a good thing that the Department of Education, even before COVID, was already about to set up an Education Futures Unit under the Office of the Secretary that is supposed to be an innovation center and with looking to the future of education, not very much constrained by the limitations of the bureaucracy catching up with the past and the present. Next slide, please. So, in relation to configuring the COVID-19 emergency response towards the future, we need to locate it within a strategic direction. And on the part of the Philippines, what we are gearing for is for education to produce learners that are able to flourish and are able to have the ability to prosper or thrive, regardless whether the circumstances are favorable or challenging. And of course, for them to be able to flourish, they need to be given the capacity for agency, for being able to act independently and make choices responsibly. They must be given work readiness, and it must be inculcated with them proactive citizenship. Next slide. So, guided by the future goals of education and the life learning framework, our Education Futures Unit uh, intends to give a future-oriented component to our emergency response by, of course, exploring technologies for remote learning, not just the advanced technologies, but multiple technologies that will facilitate remote learning. And many of these are really also solutions, not just to COVID-19, but to other emerging and past problems as well. Um, we also need to take this as an opportunity to reframe the curriculum to prioritize essential cross-cutting knowledge, skills, and mindsets, including, of course, 21st century skills, promotion of durable skills, multiliteracies, and capacities that can help confront the challenges and changes of the future. I think, and this goes very well for higher education sector must be able to anticipate the educational opportunities that will be surely come out from innovations in response to COVID-19. Of course, we also want to reinforce learning sciences, progressive assessments, and different ways of assessments, which is a necessity at the moment, the use of analytics and knowledge mobilization. And finally, to be able to uh, make more smart our learning spaces and resources, I think the COVID-19 constraints has really compelled us to look at learning spaces differently. They are not confined to physical and formal learning spaces, and they also include the informal and virtual learning spaces. Uh, uh, so this, even in our physical spaces, right now, it's important to look at things such as optimizing designs, let's say for lighting, ventilation, human flow, shared spaces, and energy efficiency, which become necessity or a demonstrated limitations of our physical learning spaces in the context of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So we are setting a future-oriented agenda to complement our emergency response. And we are presently doing our scoping study of this immediate and near future context and opportunities. So just for concluding portion, uh, next slide. If we are able to argue and convince our decision makers and stakeholders that education must continue even the time of COVID-19, and that it is a wise and strategic investment to do so, then we can leverage financing for education. And in the Philippines, we call this the Bayanihan spirit, or the spirit of community mutual help. And of course, this has to be a combination of realignments in our internal budget and defending it against cuts, maximizing the use of our operating expenditures at the field level, aligning the funds that we get as an augmentation from our local government units. And very important is the enhanced external partnerships, which is an important source of education finance. And we make it as a last resort because it is difficult to compete for supplemental budget in the context of depressed government revenues in light of the economic contraction. So, in summary, our strategy in the Philippines, in the Department of Education, is first to protect the education budget to ensure safe learning and education finance in the time of COVID. Is not mere emergency response, but constitutes necessary investments for education transformation for the future. The third is to leverage partnerships in the form of human, physical, or monetary resources. And the fourth is to ensure finance sensitivity to inequities and to learners that will be left behind. So to conclude, COVID-19 is a challenge and a problem, but it is also an opportunity for us. While health and safety are our principal concerns, this is not incompatible with learning continuity. While we seek ways to provide opportunities for learning to continue, we must at the same time be able to fast track education innovations oriented to the future. And COVID-19 is certainly changing the landscape of education, and education ministries or departments must not sit idly by and suspend learning while COVID-19 is still being contained. Instead, our education ministries and departments must be proactive agents for the defense of education budgets so that learning can continue and so that positive change can be effected. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nepo. And thank you very much for all the other speakers. Colleagues, we are massively delayed in our schedules. We are massively over time. So I think what's helped a lot is I think a lot of the questions in the Q&A have been responded to, but there are still a number of outstanding questions which are still in the open Q&A. I will exercise the discretion of the facilitator in chair in reading out just maybe two of these questions so that we are able to catch up somehow on the time, and we will request that these other questions be pursued with the individual speakers separately after this session. So, colleagues, there is an anonymous from an anonymous attendee, and perhaps maybe either Nepo or maybe Maki can respond to this. It reads, since the pandemic has laid bare inequalities in the education sector, the digital divide, gender gap, among other disparities, perhaps this is the time to consider equity in education, budgeting, and planning. And do countries in Asia have access to good disaggregated up-to-date data where they can draw decisions from, even amid these challenging times? And what could education advocates use as an advocacy tool? I think Nepo spoke to a large extent on this in terms of the experience in the Philippines. But Maki, maybe you have some thoughts on this, and Nepo some comments more pointed to the question. Maki?
Thank you very much for the question. I think, do you hear me? Oh. Oh, okay.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Sorry. I thought I lost connection because I came on the screen alone. Thank you. So yes, I think one thing is that in many of several of the education sector response plans on COVID, in light of COVID-19 in our region, they have been particularly taking a very inclusive equity lens nowadays. I think this is a positive development, although it's a little bit sad to see that we had to have a crisis to be able to enforce inclusive and equitable education planning here as a part of a response to the crisis. Now, I think the challenge in countries like our neighboring country, Laos and Myanmar, and these countries have actually been putting a COVID response plan that are very strongly, heavily emphasizing equity and inclusion issues. Now, how to kind of translate that afterwards into the existing ongoing education sector plans is another challenge, because typically the COVID response strategies and response plans are developed separately, kind of parallel to the education sector plans that are being in place already. And that could be one of the things that maybe the development partners together, the government, will have to see how we can align them better.
Okay, thanks, Maki. Nepo or Manoj, would you like to address? I think there's a question specifically on whether there's good disaggregated or up-to-date data. Maybe Manoj, would you like to speak to that? Oh, Nepo. Okay, sorry. Nepo, would you like to speak, and then we'll hear Manoj. Could Nepo be unmuted, please? I see that he's on mute.
Okay. Thank you very much. And certainly, the equity consideration will manifest itself in various forms. And we foresee that some equity issues can be more difficult than the others. So there are things, as we look at them, that will be easier to address, and some that will be more difficult to address than others. And that's the reality of it. And I think for many ministries and education departments, there is a balancing act that has to be done on looking at the big picture and looking at the micro aspects of this. And you have to understand as well the pace of decisions and execution that has to happen practically overnight and running after time, and that presents a different dimension. But let me also note that the equity impact is not one way, because there are many things and many equity gaps that are being addressed at the current and has been accelerated. Even in the digital divide, for example, it is not one way that those who had lesser access uh, are marginalized even more. In fact, especially in urban settings, then we see that when partners or local government units come in to address the digital divide, it is not something that was on the plate of the education ministries, if not in the context of COVID-19. One way that we have to introduce is really a strong monitoring and impact evaluation component of our interventions. And I think this is an opportunity to generate very important lessons. I think, in effect, we're all working under the gun, and it might be easy to lose sight of very important things. And so making sure that there is a very good monitoring and impact evaluation framework, especially of, let's say, independent parties also, can help us generate positive lessons from this episode in the education sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Nepo. Manos, would you want to come in on this?
Yes, so it is quite difficult. I tried to answer one of those questions earlier in a written way. We don't have much that we know about. We know, of course, the overall stimulus packages. We know that the education features in some of those, but not necessarily in a way that we would want. I think there are a couple of things that need to happen first, and I think Nepo also mentioned that. The first is that we need at least to make sure that governments do address some of those equity concerns through their measures before we can actually cost them and get a better sense of what is being spent. At least governments need to show that they take measures that take into account the needs of the most disadvantaged learners. And the survey that Maki was referring to, that was administered to governments, indicates that many countries have not been able to think about the needs of disadvantaged communities, whether these are the students with disabilities or those living in remote areas, or the poorest, those not having opportunities to study at home. There are so many categories of learners that have been left behind. So at least showing that there is an attempt to take their needs into account is an important first step before we even know how much they spend. And then the second point is that countries need to introduce mechanisms now before the return to school starts, so that they do monitor what the situation is in terms of the return to school. Unfortunately, that cannot necessarily rely only on the government from the center doing that. It's something that schools and communities need to play an active role in ensuring that the most vulnerable do not stay at home after school. Now, I was also mentioning that we don't know the effect of the crisis really on school attendance. There is a general tendency to think that it will be negative. It could also be positive in the sense that if opportunities around you are limited, there are no jobs, etc., there is no need for children to go to look for work because there is no work. So there's an incentive to stay a bit longer in school. We never know. It depends on the context. But there are really serious concerns that the most likely effect could be a decline in attendance, and therefore it's everyone's responsibility to make sure that we monitor closely for every family what is happening and make sure that they come back to school.
Thanks, Manos. I think there are a slew of questions addressed particularly in the Philippine context. Let me just take one because we're really running short of time. So it's a question for the Undersecretary from Marlene Floresca. How does the Department of Education ensure that learners who have been experiencing learning difficulties prior to COVID-19 are not at a higher risk of getting left behind?
I think it is a similar answer to what I had before. I think one way that we are doing it now is that we have, as part of our enrollment that is currently ongoing, added a survey, a survey form on the capacities of each learner at the home, and with respect to the home support, for us to be able to configure our interventions that are responsive to the specific conditions of the learners. And this will give us a wealth of information that was not there before. I think this were long time that we should have taken this, because we had access to the students coming to their homes, but unfortunately we did not. But now, because we have to customize learning delivery to the conditions of the learners, we will have such a data of all our learners moving forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Let me then close this panel with thanks to our speakers, Manoj, Maki, and Nepo. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and you've given us a lot of analysis that will be very important for our subsequent deliberations. We come out of here knowing that yes, the picture is bleak, the picture is grim in terms of the projections in relation to education financing. It's likely to dip. And we have also seen through the presentation of Maki that the demands on education will be greater, that there will be far more pressures to as schools reopen, as we need to reach out more to those who are left behind, that would in fact necessitate far more resources, which are dwindling. But what's heartening is ending with hearing the presentation from the Philippines that the attempt is still to stay with the ambition of SDG 4 while struggling in a very vastly altered context from when we first made these commitments as a global community, towards equity, towards inclusion, and towards higher quality in its wider forms. We've also noted in the experience in the Philippines that it's not only about getting children back in schools, it's appreciating intergenerational learning as critical in this crisis, and basically adopting a wider lifelong learning framework, which is very useful to appreciate and understand as it is concretized and applied in a concrete case such as the Philippines. So colleagues, thank you very much. There's been a spirited discussion in the Q&A and in the chat box as well. We can pause, I think, for 5 minutes before we get into the next set of panelists. But for now, thank you very much to everyone, and thank you very much for your participation and attention.
Thank you.
Anos, Maki, and Nepo, I believe you have other work, and thank you for being with us for this session. Colleagues, a 5-minute break, and then there is a poll. I think this is just a temperature check on how things are in your countries to enforce some of what we've heard from the different panelists today. So it's over to you, Thea, for the next session after the break. Thank you, colleagues.
Good afternoon, colleagues. And let me start this second session. Welcome to the second session of ASBE's webinar on education financing, challenges in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. I am Thea Soriano. I work with ASBE and I'm the moderator for this session. Okay, so across countries now, governments are currently deliberating their budgets. And as we heard from the Philippines, many of the budgets are being realigned to address the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. But we said in the first session that education is a right and that we should secure the financing of education. And therefore, with this in mind, many education coalitions, education movements, civil society organizations in Asia Pacific are currently doing budget advocacy in their respective countries. So this session will focus on what civil society organizations are doing to lobby their governments or to do budget analysis and also to track budgets in their countries, especially looking at the budgets, whether these budgets are addressing equity, if the budgets are addressing access also, and if the budgets are addressing quality education. We also heard from the first session that governments need to invest in professional development and in the readiness of teachers to do online education. And therefore, we also would like to look at how governments are investing in psychosocial support and other support that are needed both for the students and also for the teachers, and especially the marginalized sectors who are at risk of dropping out from school. So the second session, we will have three presentations. And one will look at the regional update on education financing across Asia Pacific, looking at how education is embedded in the recovery and stimulus packages of governments. And then we also have two presentations from the countries, namely Bangladesh and Pakistan. We will look at how they are advocating their governments on the education budget and what civil society can also do in terms of pushing for accountability of governments in social services in education. So let us start with the first presentation. So the topic for the next presentation is education as part of the national stimulus package. And to talk on this topic, we have Mr. Rene Raya. Rene Raya is the lead policy analyst of the Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education. He has extensive experience in research and advocacy on education financing, budget advocacy, EFA and SDG monitoring, and also on the indicator system. He led campaigns and coordinated lobby initiatives in various platforms, such as in pushing for advocacy against privatization of education, where he worked with several coalitions in doing advocacy at the UN human rights bodies. So Rene Raya, please proceed with your presentation. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Thea, and good day to everyone. Please put on my PowerPoint. And so I would like to stress as ASBE's position that education should be part of the national stimulus package when it is currently not. Okay, next slide, please. So I think the previous speakers discussed already the free-falling economy that we have experienced and still experiencing right now. It is supposed to be the worst since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The downturn actually slashed at least 9 trillion from the global economy. And here in Asia Pacific, most countries are experiencing or are bound to experience deep recession, including much of Southeast Asia and South Asia. Probably East Asia may not be so, as Maki mentioned earlier. But there has been massive job and livelihood losses, collapsing informal economy when in our region, it comprised about 70 to 80% of the economy. There has been increased hunger incidents, poverty, child labor, and possibly increase in school dropout when school resumes. No, well, the financial responses are equally staggering. IMF says $10 trillion would be needed to prevent a Great Depression. The G20 summit meeting says that they need to inject at least $5 trillion for recovery. The US already approved $3 trillion response package to combat COVID-19. And the IMF said that they are ready to deploy 1 trillion lending capacity, while the World Bank and the IFC are set to deploy $160 billion in the next 15 months. In our region, the ADB said we are preparing a 20 billion package for COVID-19. And the UN Secretary General says that we need 10% of GDP for recovery from this pandemic. Next slide. Okay, so what are the key features of the emerging stimulus packages coming from countries and from international financial institutions? Actually, this is really worrisome because the key features of these packages are to lower corporate income taxes, deferment of tax payment of big business, expand corporate incentives, and then offer interest-free business loans, guarantee funds, public subsidies to wages and paid leaves to businesses. And why should government, be the one shouldering the wages and paid leaves of employees of big business? And government equity infusion to support businesses that has been hit hard by the pandemic. And the stimulus focus on support to businesses on the supply side, rather than looking into the demand side, those who are hit hardest, the vulnerable sectors of the economy and the population. So apart from COVID-19 related financing, the stimulus packages focus on big business, big ticket infrastructure, so as to recover losses. The argument is we need to jumpstart the economy, and the business sector would be key to that to be able to generate jobs. So World Bank and the IFC package, for example, calls for fast tracking to assist companies and countries, and a significant share of this package of $160 billion would be going to the private sector. The ADB package of $20 billion, practically none for public education. So these are things that we should be worried about. In the Philippines, for example, the airline industry has been asking the government to support losses of $170 million a month. In comparison, the Philippine government is realigning the livelihood support package for families of child worker to the tune of only $2 million per year in comparison to big industries that are asking for really a huge amount of subsidy from public funds coming from the stimulus package. Yes, next slide, please. Most government and supported by the IMF and the World Bank and the ADB are actually aiming for a V-shaped recovery to get back on course. That means, there's a deep dive due to the pandemic, and what is targeted is actually to have a rapid, accelerated recovery, So it's back to the same model of rapid growth under the old normal, or probably the wrong normal, focus on financial intervention and using gross domestic product as the main and principal indicator of progress or recovery. And there is low priority given to education and the social sector, outside of the health. And recovery model may actually exacerbate inequality and may actually bring us back to the old normal, which there has been so much inequality um, and it's really the wrong normal that we should not go back into. So we assert that stimulus must focus on human capacities and well-being. The recovery measure, can be measured better and best, no, by using social and environmental indicators. We have the SDG index. We said that yes, we need to go for SDG 4 for the whole SDGs, and the SDG index may be a good measure of recovery from this pandemic. So are we able to concentrate, accelerate dropout reduction? Because we need to accelerate progress in SDG 4. Are we able to lower incidence of child labor, narrow the inequality gap, and ensure learning continuity for the most left behind, and increase use of renewable energy, which is one of the indicators in the SDG index, and also lower CO2 emissions, decrease use of fossil fuel, and many other similar social and environmental indicators that could be, the measure for our new normal, for the better normal. There are other examples of good indicators, such as that developed by Amartya Sen on pure capability measure, the index of happiness, which has been adopted already by the UN since 2012, the Gini coefficient and the Palma ratio, which measures disparity, is a good way by which is the stimulus package addressing inequality by narrowing the gap, and also the UNDP's multidimensional poverty index, which did away with economic income-based indicators. Next slide, please. Okay, so this has been mentioned by the speakers earlier. We have, shrinking fiscal space that threatens education budget. There has been tremendous pressure on education budget as funds are shifted to COVID-19 response, and also a narrowing of government revenues, and the stimulus package is not paying that much attention on really putting low priority on education, being considered as non-essential by some governments, and a high-risk sector in recovery. So ASBE asserts that we need to protect education budget, we need to combat COVID-19 in the short term and in the long term through education. And education is really a critical stimulus for recovery to build better education systems that are equitable, ensuring safe, inclusive, gender fair, and a green environment. Next slide. Okay, so I think many of the measures have been discussed by the previous speakers, but I just would like to emphasize the following, that we need to increase financing and accelerate actions towards, fast-tracking the building of safe, resilient, accessible, child-friendly schools and learning centers. And this could be one way by which we are able to generate local employment and rebuilding the local economy. Expanding and upgrading community learning hubs, libraries, community learning centers, and ICT centers towards building stronger learning and resilient societies. Then expanding and upgrading school feeding with community involvement. And this is one way by which we are able to stimulate the local economy, strengthen food production, and also community greening as stimulus for our recovery. And then there's a need for massive skills training, parents' education, upscaling adult learning programs for retooling to adapt to the new normal, and to support home-based and community-based learning. We want to organize community support and watch groups for education, broad education partnership. And I think, crisis always opens up opportunities, and I think we should be able to rally and use this situation for fundamental changes in our social and environmental context. We need to prioritize the hardest hit groups using formula-based funding and targeting the most marginalized. So in closing, ASBE would like to assert and call that we have to prioritize investment in human capability, in community solidarity, and in the green economy. Thank you very much. Thea?
Okay, so sorry. Okay, thank you for the very substantive input, and I think that deserves 5 claps from me. And this is really very important to look at education as part of the stimulus package. And this will be a challenge or a motivation for all the civil society organizations to look at the stimulus package that the governments are currently drafting or the governments have passed on to their parliament, and see, if the education agenda that we want to finance are really in that recovery package. So thank you for giving us some guidance on how to analyze the stimulus package of governments. So now we go to the second presenter, and we have Zera Arshad. She is from Pakistan. She is the National Coordinator of Pakistan Coalition for Education. She has more than 20 years of experience working in close collaboration with civil society organizations, international development agencies, and also government stakeholders. Zera is also currently the CSO representative in the Finance and Risk Committee of the Global Partnership for Education. So Zera is going to talk about securing financing for girls' education. And so now, Zera, the floor is yours. Please proceed with your presentation. Thank you, Zera, and hello.
Thank you so much, Thea. And hello to everybody. Good afternoon from my side of the world. I hope I can share my screen. So I can actually use my PowerPoint. I can switch slides. Is it possible? Okay, I'm not getting any response, so I'm starting from with our presentation. It's a very good indeed webinar, and I think there are very lots of questions, lots of new scenarios which are going to be in front of us to talk about it, to think around, and to contextualize our position into it. So I think that I'm going to congratulate ASBE and team that they actually come up with a very timely seminar when in my country and some other countries are in the process of presenting their budgets to the parliament, and they are discussing the budget, and they're talking about the financing and the post-COVID and COVID situation. So it's really good webinar in that terms and scenario as well. So coming to my presentation, I'll be talking about more on different, especially on the girls' education, and then linking the situation of girls' education in Pakistan, especially in terms of more investment, more budget for it, and linking it to the COVID situation at the moment, which we are passing through. Okay. As most of you know, that Pakistan is the fifth most populous country at the moment, and it is estimated that if such increase will be going on, we will be having 307 million by 2050. And the literacy rate at the moment in Pakistan, especially the female literacy rate, is 45%, and you can see that the urban and rural divide of the population, which is 36 versus 64 in the urban area. So there's more urbanization at the moment in Pakistan happening. Talking about the out of school children, we found that Pakistan is the second highest number and the home of the out of school children in Pakistan across the world. And we have 22.8 million 5 to 16 years age of children, in which around 12.6 million are the girls, which are not in the schools at the moment. We also the study which we have done just now, and we are in the we have finalized it this month. It's talking about that estimation of 37.3% of the primary school girls are not in schools, while the 69%, it's almost 70% of girls of the secondary school are not in the school. So that show very clear disparity of primary versus secondary, and it can show that there are a number of reasons which needs to be addressed by the government. And in this COVID situation and in the post-COVID situation, the situation is going to be more gray, and it's challenging for in terms of inclusion and marginalization of the, and the disparity issues will be coming up more in the terms of, in the post-COVID era. Looking into the, as I said earlier, that it's the system, the size of the secondary schools are very low as compared to the primary schools, and we can find out that in urban areas, 48 out of 100 are, if we have 100 primary schools as compared, it's 48 are the, we have 48 schools
Excuse
up to
me,
secondary level.
Zara.
Similarly, yeah. Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
Zara. Yeah, we can hear you, but we cannot see your slides. So, can you share your
Uh,
slide?
I
Sorry to
am actually,
interrupt.
okay. I am actually sharing my slides.
Yeah.
Okay. Now can you
Okay.
see it? Oh,
Yeah, we're starting to see the slides.
okay. That's great. So
But
now
still,
talking.
yeah. Okay, Sarah, that's fine. Okay, thanks.
Okay. So I was actually talking about the primary versus secondary school disparity, and we can find out that around every 100 schools of primary in urban, we have 48 schools of secondary, and we have like 22 in rural. So that's among the secondary versus primary is a disparity, and then rural versus urban is also a disparity, which can show that we have less schools in rural areas as compared to we have less schools in urban areas as well, but they are, as compared to the rural, they are much better. But in rural areas, the disparity of schools, secondary schools, is very much high. uh, and then you can see this is the provincial distribution of out of school children. We'll find out that in urban, at the provincial level and the federal administrative areas, the out of school children in grade primary schools is much higher in the Punjab and Sindh. They are relatively like, they are comparatively on the close, with the close margin, they are high. But if we can see the secondary schools, we find out that Punjab has more out of school girls as compared to Sindh. So that show that there is the schools are not the, we need more schools, obviously. We need more girls secondary schools, that's also clear from here side, and then we need more budget for this. So we will be talking in the next slides that how, what are the other findings we have got from our study. I actually missed that this study is a kind of stock taking of last 10 years since the RTE, Right to Education, incorporated in our constitution. And it is actually showing the trends of budget in terms of GDP, in terms of domestic financing at different provincial level, and it's also showing that what is estimations we are looking forward in terms of numbers, not in terms of GDP or education financing, but this is a very a big question we are having at the moment in Pakistan, that we already have a very low GDP rate, and as compared to GDP, if we are going to say that we are spending much less on education. And if we are talking about the domestic resource mobilization, we do say that we are completing, or we are actually incorporating the international benchmarks, which is 15 to 20% of the domestic resource mobilization. But as compared to the magnitude of the problem in Pakistan, it is very less, and it's not up to the mark that where we can actually put all the children in the schools. So you can see this is a female dropout rate, which we actually calculated from like 24 years. It's 1993 to 2017 or 22 years. average, we will find out that in urban and rural, we'll find out that there are dropout rates even in the capital of Pakistan, the Islamabad, and it's one of the area, the Gilgit-Baltistan, we have the 100% retention and rate from and the transfer of from the primary to secondary, which is obviously have their own reasons. It's one of the factors that Aga Khan schools are very much engaged in that area, and they are actually trying to provide education to everybody. Looking into the retention rate, you can also find out this is the overall scenario, and we can find out that at grade 1 we have 100% of children, while it's going to be drop out constantly grade by grade, and we'll find out that it's, you can see the urban area, the urban reflection here. You can see that it's much better than the rural. It is going to be you can see now, we can see the peak. So at the grade 1 we have all children schools, while in rural areas it's going to be down, and it's a steep like that. Coming to the out of school children, that if we want and we find out that as compared to 2012, we have a gradual decrease in the number of out of school children, and this is a decline by the 12%, but it is calculated by in our study that if we are going into same rate, we will have another 42 years to put all the existing out of school children number into schools. That means year 2062. We are not taking into account the number of increase in the population and the number of increase in the out of school children of that age year by year. We are just talking about if we need to clear the backlog, existing backlog, we need 42 years to come up with this. So we actually try to encompass that what are the issues, what are the factors involved in this, that our girls are not in schools, and in terms of inclusion, we find out that there are two major areas, which is the push out factors and the pull out factor. And push out factors mainly talking about the access to schools, number of classrooms, teachers, basic facilities, transportation, and obviously for the disadvantaged and disabled children, we need extra facilities in the schools. In terms of pull-out factor, we found we classified it into the two main factors. It is about the social cultural factor, which is talking about the migration, early marriages. We know some of the areas, tribal and feudal systems, they actually restrict the education for the children, especially the girls. Then in the economic factors, there's poverty, and now in the post-COVID situation, we as are my earlier panelist talking about, that we'll find out that due to the poverty, increase in the poverty, the children will not be able to go to schools, and especially the girls dropout will be increasing in future. So coming into how the GDP ratio in Pakistan, and we will find we have this to like 20 years compilation of the GDP ratio, and we can find out that except in 2016, when we have our GDP is 2.30, we are continuously around 2.10 or 2.15. So rather than saying that we are actually endorsing, we are committed to all the international benchmarks, we are still not able to increase our GDP. It's a slight increase from 2, but we are still not able to reach to 3 or 4% of GDP, rather than going to the 6% of the GDP. You can see that this is the education financing pattern at the provincial level, the Punjab, Sindh, KP, and it's talking about the different fiscal years, 2014 to 15, 16 to 17, and 18 to 19. And it is found that that the continues, it's not on a constant level, so it's rather going down and up. We can say that it's more than 15%, but as compared to the magnitude of the issue, as compared to the population, as compared to the economic issues, it is not it is not going to fulfill our challenges. It's not going to fulfill the gap. So we need to come up with a number. So that study which we have done is talking about the number rather than talking about the percentages. We are talking about the number, that how much money we are required to bring all our children to the schools. Uh, uh, we are not Pakistan is a poor country. We are actually, our economic indicators are going fall. This is the first time we are in the minus at the moment. And it's because of the major issues that we are not collecting we are more into the indirect taxation, not collecting the direct taxation. We are not expanding our tax to GDP ratio or the tax net for those who are earning more. They are not charging, the government is not charging them more taxes. Similarly, the debt, public debt we have to pay a large amount of money into those debt servicing, and then we are giving a number of subsidies to our textile and agriculture sector, and that's basically benefiting to the industrialists, not to the poor people, not to the farmer, not to the labor. So that's also a kind of major political issues, economical issues we are facing at the moment. Coming to the political parties, if we're talking about since 2008 till 2018, we have the governments of three main political parties: Pakistan People's Party, Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, and Mao Pakistan Tehreek Insaf. All of them in their manifestos talking about and pledging about the 6 or 4% of GDP. However, we have seen an earlier slide that we are not able to. It's a kind of a constant thing that we are still on the around 2% or a plus minus 2% slight increase on the GDP, which is allocated for the education. This slide is very much showing about the recent 2018 and 19 budget and the development versus non-development, and we'll find out that whatever the education budget is allocated, the major portion of that budget, it's around 80 to 90% of is allocated for the non-development, which is and especially about the utilities and salaries. While it's the development budget is very less, and most of the at the time it is unutilized, and then it's going to be collapsed. We find out and we talk about, as I mentioned quite in my presentation, that we do try to figure out that what is the exact number of money or the rupees we required to bring all our children, out of school children, the existing out of school children into school. And we find out that we need 6.5 trillion to bring our girls, out of school girls, into schools. And then if we add 5.5 trillion more to bring out of school boys into school, the total sum is rupees 12 trillion, which is a huge amount of money, and that the government needs rigorous economical reforms, rigorous ways to tax our to tax those who are earning a lot, increase the tax net, and bring that money to social sector, especially to education in Pakistan. This is the
Excuse me,
calculation.
Zara. I'm sorry to interrupt you again. This is for the second time. Can you wrap up your presentation? I'm so sorry.
Yes, and
yes.
yeah,
Okay,
in
thank
3
you.
minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is
okay.
the calculation of the table which was showing that why this 12 how from where the 6.5 of 12 trillion amount is coming up. This and I must say that when we calculated it, we also highly recommend that 1/3 of this amount should go to the running expenses like salaries, while the 2/3 should go to the other expenses. The development expenses include textbooks, food, health and hygiene, etc. Now coming to the post-COVID scenario, it's that including that out of school children, which I mentioned, we have additional 40 million children who are not in school at the moment because of the abrupt close down of the schools due to the COVID situation. And if this COVID situation persists, and that is what we are having, that we are not even having a peak in our in our country, which is coming up in somewhere in last of July and August, that will show that the situation is going to be very bad in Pakistan, and then school are not going to be opening up soon. And we also find out that show that urban population is going to be increased, and that show that the schools will be due to the poverty and the economic issues and pressures. Girls are not going to schools, and boys, same as Mike actually shared in her presentation, that's going to be happen in Pakistan. It's very much clear at the moment from our study as well. Uh, uh, Females at the moment are not able to study, while we have different strategies in Pakistan, which is talking about the high tech, low tech, and low and no tech strategies and modalities. But we found out that rural areas, the marginalized community, females, they are not able to actually go into able to have the education at the moment in their schools in either of those technologies and the modalities, because the schools because of the learning gaps, because of the shortage of electricity and other reasons, they don't have and obviously it is very difficult for them to study to do the solo study at the home. And then girls are more marginalized because they are actually involved in this home course rather than attending those schools which are coming up through the radio, TV, or through the no tech home based guided learning. So this is what we have at the moment. Our study is talking about. If there are any questions, I'm happy to respond them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zara, and apologies for interrupting you twice. But and this is a very good presentation. And what we particularly liked about it is the gendered analysis of the impact of COVID-19. And if we look at the earlier session, it seems that equity is really a challenge from the Philippines. We heard that addressing equity in education will be a challenge considering the impact of COVID-19. But as civil society, we know that these equity issues cannot wait, because we have already seen, the inequalities of society and how this has impacted the lives of many people in our respective countries. So if we delay addressing equity in education, that will really exacerbate the already existing inequalities in our societies. So thank you, Zara, for that very good gendered analysis on the impact of COVID-19. I think that is, again, one framework that we can use for our budget advocacy, especially now that governments are drafting their 2021 budget. Okay, so now we go from Pakistan, we go to Bangladesh. And we have with us Enamal Hook of the Campaign for Popular Education. Enam, as we call him, is the Deputy Director of CAMPE, and he has over 20 years of experience in development sector, particularly in the areas of basic education, research, monitoring, evaluation, and policy advocacy. He is one of the coordinators of the Education Watch. This is a very important resource in Bangladesh. Education Watch is a citizens-based education research, and that is done by CAMPE every 2 years. And this Education Watch is widely recognized not only in Bangladesh, but also in Asia Pacific and also in Africa. So Enam will discuss for us what they're doing in CAMPE, particularly advocating to protect education budgets and civil society experiences in Bangladesh. So Enam, the floor is yours. Can you show
Yeah.
the, or we show the screen, right, Enam?
Can I show the screen? That would be better. Okay.
Okay, we can see the screen now, Enam.
Yeah. Uh, so I'll be sharing, first of all, good afternoon. I'm Kemen Haq from Campe, Bangladesh. We'll be sharing some experience of civil society with regard to budget advocacy and protecting the education budget. Can you go to the next slide? Next slide, please. Yeah. So if you think about the context as civil society, one of our biggest demand is to allocate 15 to 20% of the national budget or 4 to 6% of the GDP for education to fulfill the right to education obligation, particularly the availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability of the education. And CSOs are contributing to achieving the national commitment to this development goal. In addition to the SDGs, we also try to link with the national vision, like for Bangladesh, we have new vision for 2041. We have election manifesto. We have other international charters and treaties to which we try to look into the education budget. And the key area is we'd like to promote that the transformation of the education system will ensure no one is leaving behind. So now Bangladesh was progressing a bit fast comparing to many other South Asian countries, and we have achieved almost universal access to primary education. But this global pandemic has halted the progress. At the moment, all schools are closed since March 18, and about 40 million learners are affected directly. However, government is trying to provide some remedial measures and distance learning through television. Immediate after closing of the school, government has initiated distance learning through television, and the Prime Minister's office has one special wing which is called Access to Information, and they have supported the internet-based learning activities, and all providers are helping to establish an education hub through which learner and teacher can get access to education, and parents can provide their caregiving role. So to overcome the pandemic, government has initiated stimulus package, particularly for the economic recovery, food security intervention, and health recovery programs. But in terms of education in emergency, it is highly dependent on external support and alignment of some of the development budget. So considering the loss from the civil society, we believe that it will not be very easy to recover, and we need to have a 2 to 3 years education recovery program that the children can catch up, they are traumatized, and how they can recover. So around that, we have some advocacy initiative. I would like to share some of the experience on that. Can we move to the next slide? Okay. So the major advocacy process is networking, informing, developing, and influencing. So what we did, we engaged with the education sector plan, we engaged with the local education group, education cluster, and other state-led and CSO-led process. And we have contributed to the education hub, as I mentioned. So then we also communicate with the member and partner organization. We also communicated with the teacher association. We try to give two messages that during this pandemic, the first priority is to look into the protection issue of the children, and then continuity of education during emergencies. We have tried to take stock what is happening, who is doing what, and how the education is being affected. We have carried out one rapid response survey and about 115 NGOs responded to this survey, and 11 Teachers Association also responded. We have shared the salient feature of this study through different platforms. And we have prepared memorandum for the finance minister and submitted it officially. We have also prepared open appeal for the prime minister, and we have lobbied with the champions within the government, civil society, and political sphere. So I'd like to share some of the salient feature of the rapid response survey. Can we move to the next slide? Okay. So it shows that the NGO-run intervention, out of 40 million, NGO-run intervention has affected about 2.8 million learners. And it includes pre-primary, primary, formal and non-formal both, adult literacy and lifelong learning, and technical and vocational education and other types of education support. So can we move to next slide? As immediate response, it shows that about half of the NGOs, they have communicated with the teacher and learner and parents through telephone. They have carried out some awareness raise campaign using the local cable network. Some of them also provided supplementary reading material support and some other health and hygiene related awareness intervention. Many of those are immediate spontaneous response because we have carried out this survey during April, mid-April to mid-May. So external resource was very limited at the time, but some of the program were supported by international NGOs and development partners. Can you move to next slide? So with regard to the challenges, we find that learners are facing a lot of challenge. The respondent says that the dropout will increase due to COVID. Almost 84% of the respondents believe that it will increase significantly. There increased absenteeism and irregular attendance. There will be malnutrition as impact of which will impact learning ability, because immediate after the pandemic, the school meal program and school feeding program was suspended. So the children who are highly dependent on school meal for their nutrition, they will be affecting to a large extent. There is a risk of children being transferred into child labor market and to support the family income. Due to household in the work engagement, many of the learner may lag behind. There might be gender-related effect, particularly the girls may be victim of early marriage. Children may be withdrawn from education due to other priority and household cost, because although officially basic education is free in Bangladesh, primary education is free in Bangladesh, but there is more than 50% out-of-pocket cost. So it will have an impact on children's attendance. The early marriage may lead to early pregnancy as well. Can you move to next? Yeah. Like children, teacher will also face a lot of challenge, particularly the private education institution, government subsidized private education institution, and community-based education institution. About 88% of the respondents believe that the syllabus and lessons may not be covered on time. So we need to focus on how to catch up with the learning or what would be the alternative remedial measures. Many of them believe that teachers lack expertise to use ICT and not willing to or able to teach online. So there is both willingness and ability. And concerned teacher may not receive salary on time, particularly the non-government teachers. And some of the private school teacher may lose their job. Can you move to next? Yeah. Some other challenges include the children from, it's obvious the children are traumatized. There are issues of mental health. There are senior citizens at soul and facing different kind of challenges, particularly the treatment support or hospitalization support is very difficult at the moment. There are a lack of knowledge of caregivers or parents on COVID, and many of them are also non-literate or neo-literate. So they cannot provide support to the children. There are inadequate access to alternative learning modalities. For example, although the government has initiated a television and internet-based learning platform, but only half of the children can get access to television. Only 14% learner can get access to radio. However, through feature phone, some FM band can be accessible. So, and community radio are accessible. We have communicated, and government is working with them as well. There is no supportive learning environment in urban slums, particularly. In urban slums, their living condition is very miserable. There is no dedicated learning space. There is inadequate access to general health care, which has other impact, including education. There is risk of being gender-based violence, particularly immediate after opening the school, reopening the school. We might face out of school children, and which has linkage with kind of violence on the way to school and inside school. Next slide, please. Okay, considering all those, from campaign, we have formulated 4 overarching recommendation, and that is supported by a number of expansion. I'm not going to the expansion, I'm going to the high level recommendations only. At least 2 to 3 years plan is required to deal with the disruption in the academic calendar, particularly completing lessons, adjusting exams, adjusting vacations, supporting learner, use of school reopening guideline prepared by UNESCO, UNICEF, World Bank, and WFP. And we need to work on the complementary TV and radio-based program, internet and mobile-based lessons, and enhance teachers' skills and institution to improve their e-learning environment and infrastructure. So the other area is we need to look into the social safety net program, particularly the conditional cash transfer or stipend program for the learner. We need to strengthen it in terms of amount and in terms of coverage. It could be worthwhile to mention here that only the government primary school children are getting stipend, but those children studying in the non-formal school, which are coming from the most marginalized, they are not getting access to stipend, or they are not getting access to school meal. So we urge that both school meal and stipend program should be extended to the most marginalized. There should be extra school-based lesson for student and school as a school response. And we want that NGOs and CBOs should be involved in this kind of intervention. So the 4th point is considering the rethinking about the post-COVID situation. The new normal will not be like what we did earlier. Overall school environment, teaching learning process, everything has been started changing, and it will continue. So we need to look into the mitigation, recovery, quality equity issues, and better use of ICT. We need to ensure that teachers are better supported, and their performance are being tracked and help them to improve their perform. There should be reform of the student assessment. We observed that from the earlier presentation, many countries has started testing. So as our schools are still closed, how this testing process will go, we need to rethink how we'll assess the learner. Then we need to rethink about the non-formal second chance education under the education and emergency program, and involving research institution and NGOs in the recovery program and recovery planning. The 5th recommendation is to protect education gain and prevent reversal. As mentioned earlier, during past 22 decades, Bangladesh has progressed a lot. due to this school closure and priority on other sector, education might face a lot of challenge. So we need to prevent that kind of losing trend. And we need to rethink about education budget as an instrument for leading the education recovery program. And that is why we demanded to raise the budget up to 15% of the national budget and ensuring better and targeted use of resources. Besides the state budget, there are aid from multilateral and bilateral agencies for education in emergencies. Those are also part of this overall planning. Maybe move to next slide. Yeah. So as follow-up intervention, as I mentioned that we have submitted a detailed memorandum to the finance minister, and we try to, we have conducted a virtual press briefing. We engaged the media, and in the media has covered many of the issues. Through media scanning, we find that media pick up some point like demanding 15% of national budget for education, consider education recovery plan to retain the progress. There are children at risk, so out of school children factors need to be addressed through this education, through this budget. And ICT has been considered as an opportunity, despite dangers of this COVID pandemic. All the people, irrespective of their identity, has enhanced their capability in using ICT. And many countries has transformed their education system and are more reliant on the ICT-based equipment. And when we are talking with the learner and teachers, we find that there are externalities of ICT which can benefit the rural children and teachers. So this is one area most of the media has take up, that we need to strengthen ICT, particularly enhance the connectivity of ICT, enhance the bandwidth, and ensure that all school has internet connectivity, all teachers are trained on using ICT, and then enhance the coverage of stipend and school meal. So with that, we also submitted a memorandum, open appeal to the Prime Minister. In the Prime Minister's appeal, we try to emphasize on the budget issue and education recovery program, back to school program, ICT infrastructure development, interagency coordination, and strengthening social safety net program. And we have also raised that our education policy is about 10 years old. So revisit the education policy and emphasize on research. So those are some key area we try to draw the attention of the Prime Minister. So can you move to next slide?
And I am sorry, but you have to wrap up your presentation.
Yeah, maybe in 1 minute. I'm almost at the end.
Okay.
So the great news is our budget has been announced, placed before the Parliament on 11th June, and government says we have allocated 15.10% of the national budget for education and science. So immediately it shows up the big gain. However, when we look into the budget detail, we find in terms of size, it has been increased significantly. In terms of share, it was somehow overstated by including other ministry budget in education to make it 15%. And there is inadequate data to look into the sensitivity issue. We need to engage further with the tracking issue. So can we move to the last slide? Yeah, the next slide is the last slide. So we have tried to look into what other ministry come into the education budget. On the left-hand side, if you look at the green area, that is the education dedicated budget. And we observed that only 11.68% has been allocated for education, which is 0.01% more compared to last year. So we are not happy at all. We saw there are budget for Ministry of Science and Technology, and Ministry of ICT has been included with education, and that gives the figure. So on the right hand side, if you look at that, how the share of education budget compared to overall national budget, the gap is widening. If you look at the uh, different ministry which deal with education, there is some increasing trend with some ups and downs, but it is not as required. So those are some critical issues. We'll continue our advocacy with the government because now it is being discussed in the parliament. We are engaged with the champions, we are engaging with the media, that how some of the issues can be considered before finalization of the budget. So those are some of the highlights of our advocacy around the COVID-19 to influence the national education budget. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Enam, for that presentation. And my congratulations to Campe for doing in such a quick time the rapid response, rapid survey, which provided several insights and recommendations for not only for education, but also on how the government can address COVID-19 pandemic, the challenges brought by COVID-19 pandemic. So congratulations to Campe and thank you for presentation. Yeah, I think you raised a very important point in your presentation, which is on teacher-related challenges. And I saw from the chat box, Pak Kudrat from Indonesia was saying that we should also do some research on teachers' readiness on providing online education. And I think in some countries, like in the Philippines, there has been a survey conducted by the Department of Education where they gauge, the readiness of the teachers in providing online education, whether they have the laptop, the equipment, if they have internet connection. But I think also very important is the pedagogy, how teachers can facilitate online learning. And this is something that we should also argue in our education budget advocacy, how to train teachers and educators on using online technology to facilitate learning. So thank you for that. So now we go to a very short open forum. And I can see from the question and answer, there are two questions. I would like to read them. So one, I would like to give to Zara. Zara, there is a question here, how is gender perspective embedded in financing education, in particular in Pakistan? And I think the second related question needs a lot of explanation, but anyway, I'm going to say it now. How do you embed gender in crafting education content and pedagogy? That's for Zara. And so I'll give you time, Zara, to think about the question. And then for Enam, there is a question related to how is disability integrated in your advocacy. So I saw that from the chat box. There was a question from Prativa asking what is the percentage of budget in Bangladesh devoted to education, but I think that has been answered in your presentation. Okay, so those are the two questions. And then I will read the question for Rene Raya later. So Zara first and then Enam.
Thank you, Thea. I think both questions are in terms very vast, and especially if we talk about the gender segregated data, we all know that it's not available, or it's available very less. And in this report, which we have just finalize and publish, we actually the researcher, the economist with us, who actually author of the report, he calculate and compute the data to get the gender segregated data. So it's not very easy to get all those data, and it's handy and it's available on the website, but we all know that it's a very continuous demand from the civil society, experts, educationists, that we need to disaggregate the data needs to be disaggregated in terms of disability, gender, marginalized communities. And we found that to some extent the data is available, but it's not there. And especially in this COVID situation, we need to find out that it's all, because now the data which we have earlier, it's going to be way different and way more gray. We will finding out that the situation is going to be very exhausted, and we find out that we need to develop more indicators in terms of COVID, and linking the 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 different segregated data with the health issues, with the implications of this COVID situation on mental health as well as the physical health. So there is more relationships, more co-relationships needs to be find out. What was the other question? I can't hear you.
How do you
Thea, you need to open your
okay.
mic. Yeah.
Okay, for the third time. How do you embed the gender into the content and pedagogy? I think this is a timeless question, not only during this time of, but I think more so in this time of COVID-19. Yeah.
I think at the moment we found that all the speakers from the first panel and the second panel, we are actually talking more about that we are actually learning the situation. So it's like,
Yeah.
it's not something very usual. It's a very unusual situation. It actually restrict our mobility, which affect our work. It affect our most of the things are affected by this. So we need to find out that what is happening, how is it happening, what are the context setting, what are the contexts at the moment, where governments are more into the economic situation and health situation, so that we find out that education is going to be at the back of their mind or at the back of the priorities. So one thing we need to come up with, that how we prioritize education, how we bring education as a most important thing. Then of course the pedagogy, in terms of if we are using the innovations in terms of IT technology, and we find it out that it's coming up, it's a continuous reports coming up that technology is not a solution at the moment in our countries. We need to find out the solutions. We need to equip ourselves. We need, like we are not equipped with handling with the Zoom. It's as we are learning. So it is very important to find out, and I might think that after few months we might able to find out that what is actually happening to us. We are still in the, every time there is a new news on the and we are trying to struggle with and trying to unpack the situation. So pedagogy capacities, children familiarity with the technology is also important, because in our country, in case of Pakistan, the rural community and the marginalized community don't have the access to the technology, even though they don't have the access to the TV, or if they have that access to the television, they don't have the power, electricity is not there. So there are a number of issues which needs to be dealt, which need to be come up. And then I think it's very important that the donor community, they have to think around it, that it's very easy to pitch for the easy loans. It's very easy to come up with that we are giving the World Bank or ADB, they are coming up with the low cost loans, but that is also a additional burden to the countries. So that how the donors are coming up in a way that they can actually contextualize the issues. They can find out that every country has specific issues, specific problems in terms of their political economy, and how to deal with it. And that's a required a number of interventions, number of issues to get familiar, and then come up to produce things. So this is, I think, I try to be as comprehensive as I can.
Thank you, Zara. Yeah, a lot of things to do, especially now that the challenges that we face are not only doubled, but really tremendous impact of COVID-19 is affecting not only education, but in many spheres in our life. Okay, so now, Enam.
First of all, with regard to disability issue, Before going to disability issue, I'd like to mention that flag up that whenever campaign does any advocacy, we use some adversity lens. And in our adversity lens, we'd like to highlight few areas. For example, men versus women, uh, rural versus urban, then some specific issues like disability, ethnicity, people's living in difficult to access areas like Chorhaur and working children. So those are some critical area. Campaign always use the lens to get those insight. But unfortunately, as it was, we are relying on the internet connectivity and people's willingness to provide data at that pandemic situation. We didn't got enough insight about the persons with disability. We also we got very limited information about the uh, ethnic minority group, and we got information from one part of the country. From other part we didn't get enough information. So what we did, we have organized one webinar on 19th May. Some of you might join that meeting, but later on we have organized a series of thematic consultation. So next week we are meeting with the teachers group. So we need to have deeper understanding about the teachers issue. We'll have the specific interaction with group and persons with disability group. So those area we will have further interaction, and we'll come up with some further insight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I think many of us here in the call are also, coalitions and NGOs doing our own advocacy in our respective countries. So it will be good for us to share, the instruments that we are using for the survey, for example. I think Pak Kudrat from Indonesia would be interested to look at the instrument that you're going to use for the teacher survey in Bangladesh. So maybe we can have that kind of exchanges amongst us also, so we can get comparable data. Okay, so now we go almost to the end of our discussions of our webinar. I'm going to invite Rene, if you have some last message for us before I go into the key takeaways from this webinar. And then before we go into the closing, because I'm very aware that it's 6:11 p.m. in Manila, and many of us would be very busy already. And perhaps because we're at home, we are also doing some domestic chores, I know. So Rene, any message from you?
Well, just to respond immediately to Esanor's question, I would like to stress the point that education, I think, would be the most important determinant of social and economic development. There's numerous studies and evidence to show this. I think I remember in ASBE, we did a study on the impact of education on poverty, and we did that in the Philippines and Bangladesh. It's actually a comparative study. And we noted that 10 years of education can lift household out of poverty, meaning that if you are able to complete junior secondary education, it is a basis by which you can go beyond poverty. And we know that in the previous MDG EFA monitoring, we said that if we are able to only have 10 years of school life expectancy, then we can be able to meet that poverty target of reducing poverty by half by 2015. That's the MDG EFA. And education is strongly correlated with infant mortality, reducing infant mortality, child mortality, fertility, and enhancing women's mobility, participation, and decision-making of women in the political and community life, and improve maternal health as well as the political participation of everyone. So I think I would go back to my point that it is definitely a very strong argument to go for education, increase budget for education, and accelerate actions, no, to overcome barriers in education so that we can move forward, we can have a better normal, and inequality can be addressed. So yeah, that's it, Thea, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rene, Enam, and Zara. Thank you for your very valuable inputs. And this can guide all of us, as we do our education budget advocacy this year. And also, as we look at the stimulus recovery package of our government, let us make sure that education is there. Okay, so thank you very much, and maybe 3 claps for the 3 of you. Okay, so before we end, I would like to mention 3 takeaways and to end this session. But I forgot, I would like to acknowledge the messages in our chat box. So a lot of you sent their messages. I'm so sorry that we cannot read all of them, but I'm sure colleagues can read them. So thank you, Prativa, Robbie, Marie-Claude, BK from Nepal, and Subrat and Susmita, also our colleagues in ASBE. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts in the chat box. Now, my 3 takeaways from this session is: 1, civil society continues to do advocacy amidst the challenges of the pandemic. And I think rightly so, we should continue pushing for our demands. We should continue engaging our governments. And I have heard from other national education coalitions, such as in the Philippines and Nepal, that they are, and also in Vietnam, they are also part of the online meetings or virtual meetings of their government. So during the pandemic, we have been very creative also in our engagements with government. So I think that's a good point that we have been doing, and civil society advocacy continues even with the challenges that we face, even with the limited mobility. The second takeaway that I've heard from this session is that we need really to secure funding for education, but importantly, to look at education budgets, ensuring that the equity issue is there, the gender issues are there. It's not only education, the cognitive part, but also to look at psychosocial support. Actually, one of the questions that was raised in the chat box is, how do we do that? How do we provide psychosocial support how can we ensure that school feeding continues when schools are really closed, So all of these questions we have to address. But first, we have to, as our colleague in Mongolia said, we have to know what we want to advocate and how to meet our agenda, and then we put in the budgets that our governments need to produce so that education is continually funded. And lastly, let me borrow what Robbie said in the chat box, and Marie-Claude also agreed to, that we should look at these valuable lessons that we have now in building a resilient education system, because this is very important. We're not only talking about emergency education, but important to look at really building a resilient, better education system. Okay, so now we have, for our closing, one of the EC Executive Council members of ASBE, and we know that she is very busy because the Vietnam government is finalizing its education sector plan, and but we're very lucky to have her in this webinar. So I would like to call Kim An of the Vietnam Association for Education for All, or VAEFA, Ms. Kim An Nguyen, who is also an EC member of ASBE. So Kim An, are you there, Kim An? There. Hi, Kim An.
Okay. Good afternoon from Hanoi to everyone. Thank you.
Kim An, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Not so well.
Okay, what can I do? Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah, we need more volume, please. A little bit.
Oh, already maximized. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, we can hear you now.
So good afternoon from Hanoi to everyone. And on behalf of ASBE, I would like to thank all the participants for a very informative and interesting afternoon. I think at the peak, we have 112 participants. And we've heard a lot of challenges and also worrying trends on financing for education and also about the gaps, the declining trends, the focus of the stimulus package where education is not a priority. But I think we also aware of the available opportunity and also the new opportunities. And we also heard about what's going on in our countries, the learning continuity plan in the Philippines, the work from NC Nepal, the work from Kampe Bangladesh, and those are very encouraging. And with that, I would like to thank all our panelists, Dr. Manos Antoninis from the Global Monitoring Report, Ms. Maki Hashia Kaywa from UNESCO Bangkok, Mr. Nepom Malualam from the Philippine Education Department, Mr. Rene from ASBE, Zeha from PCE Pakistan, and Enam from Kampe Bangladesh. And also thank Maria for the opening and setting the tone for our discussions and for your facilitations, and also Thea for your facilitations of the discussions. And I think Leah as well for all the technical support at the background to enable us to have this very interesting interactive afternoon, though we are very distant from each other. So really thank you everyone. And I think what all have been discussed and what we have heard will be useful for our work of our own organizations and our joint work at the regional and global level. So I look forward to our continued discussions on this topic, and all the best to everyone, and stay safe, and see you later. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, see you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone, and thank you. And we hope we can have another session, another webinar.
Okay, bye-bye.
In the near future.
Bye-bye.
Yes, continue with the coalition in the next days.
Take care, everyone, and stay safe.
Yes, take care, everyone.
Colleagues, there will be more discussions tomorrow of our coalitions. So there'll be more time to deepen understandings of what we've picked up today. So more strength. Thanks, everyone, and catch you all, some of you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. Take care. Stay safe.
Mm-mm.